Tonight, we unravel the haunting case of Evelyn Hernández, a teenager from El Salvador whose personal tragedy collided with the weight of a nation's law. Tonight's clue question: could the lack of medical evidence have been the single factor that shifted Evelyn's fate? Or was the outcome already determined by the laws themselves? Let's begin to dive into this case. In April of 2016, 19-year-old Evelyn Hernández was rushed to a hospital in El Salvador after a suspected miscarriage. What followed would become a landmark trial, igniting global outrage. Accused of aggravated homicide, Evelyn stood trial not only for a death, but for a system that condemned her. It began with blood. Too much blood. On the morning of April 6th, Evelyn collapsed in the bathroom of her modest home in El Carmen, a rural town in El Salvador. She had been experiencing sharp abdominal pain for hours, unaware of what was truly happening inside her body. According to reports, Evelyn's mother discovered her slumped on the floor, pale, and drifting in and out of consciousness. An ambulance rushed her to a public hospital in Cojutepeque. The doctors, alarmed by the level of internal trauma, soon discovered signs of a recent birth, but no baby in sight. Authorities were alerted almost immediately. Back at the home, in the latrine behind the house, the body of a newborn was found, the umbilical cord still attached. No signs of deliberate harm were obvious at first glance, but suspicions escalated quickly. Without delay, Evelyn was detained. Still recovering from blood loss, she faced accusations of intentionally ending the life of her child. Her hands cuffed, her body weak. Evelyn began a legal battle that would span years and pull international attention to the heart of El Salvador's absolute abortion ban. Evelyn Beatriz Hernández Cruz was born and raised in El Carmen, a rural municipality in Cuscatlan, El Salvador. She lived in a modest home with her mother and younger siblings. Life was not easy. Poverty, gang violence, and lack of opportunity shaped her daily existence, like so many other young women in the region. Evelyn had dreams. She wanted to become a nurse, to help others, to change her future. But reality stood in stark contrast. At age 18, according to reports, Evelyn was repeatedly raped by a gang member, a man who allegedly threatened her life and the lives of her family if she ever spoke out. Evelyn never told her mother about the assaults, out of fear, out of shame, out of the crippling silence imposed by a culture of violence and impunity. When Evelyn's health began to change, she claimed she did not know she was pregnant. She reportedly mistook the symptoms for gastrointestinal problems, common in rural areas with limited access to medical care. She kept going to school. She kept helping her mother around the house until the morning she collapsed. The infant, later examined by forensic teams, was estimated to have reached approximately 32 to 34 weeks of gestation. But due to decomposition, a clear cause of death could not be confirmed. Despite no prior record of violence, no signs of premeditation, Evelyn was treated not as a victim, but as a suspect. Her life, her body, became the evidence. In the eyes of Salvadoran authorities, there was only one suspect: Evelyn Hernández. Despite being the one who sought medical attention, despite having no criminal history, she was quickly charged with aggravated homicide. Investigators claimed that Evelyn had concealed her pregnancy, given birth in secret, and allowed the baby to die. The prosecution's theory was that the infant had been born alive and Evelyn had allowed it to drown in the latrine. Yet, no eyewitnesses existed. No autopsy conclusively confirmed the cause of death. The medical examiner could not determine if the baby was stillborn or if it had taken a single breath. Evelyn's defense team argued that this was not a crime, but a medical emergency. They emphasized the trauma she had endured, the lack of prenatal care, and the state's failure to consider alternative explanations. But the legal climate in El Salvador was unforgiving. Since 1998, the country had banned abortion under all circumstances, even in cases of rape or danger to the mother. Dozens of women had already been imprisoned for pregnancy-related complications, some for decades. To prosecutors and conservative factions, Evelyn represented defiance. To international observers, she represented injustice. Throughout the ordeal, no other suspects were seriously pursued. The man who allegedly raped Evelyn was never brought to justice. His name never publicly revealed. The system, it seemed, focused only on Evelyn. April 6th, 2016. The day began like any other in the Hernández household. Evelyn, 19 years old and still attending school, had been complaining of severe back and stomach pain. She assumed it was something she ate. Her mother, unaware of any pregnancy, believed it could be a gastrointestinal infection, but as the pain grew sharper and blood began to appear, panic set in. According to reports, Evelyn went to the family's outdoor latrine behind their home, a small concrete structure with a crude wooden door. Moments later, her mother heard a loud thud, followed by silence. Inside, she found Evelyn collapsed, soaked in blood, pale and barely conscious. What neither of them knew at that moment was that Evelyn had just given birth, alone, without warning, in a latrine pit filled with waste. Emergency services were called. Evelyn was rushed to a hospital in Cojutepeque, nearly 30 minutes away. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride. Nurses at the hospital were alarmed. Upon examination, they discovered signs of recent childbirth, but Evelyn had not arrived with a baby. Authorities were alerted, and police were dispatched to the Hernández home. What they found was grim. Inside the latrine, in murky water just below the surface, was the body of a newborn. The baby's umbilical cord remained attached. The forensic report later noted that the level of decomposition made it difficult to determine if the child had ever taken a breath or had been stillborn. No signs of trauma were found, no bruises, no cuts, no deliberate harm. The prosecution's theory was stark. Evelyn had delivered the child, knew it was alive, and allowed it to drown. But no physical evidence supported that claim. No neighbors reported cries. No medical proof indicated air in the lungs. Doctors testified that Evelyn's condition was consistent with a sudden, unassisted labor, the kind that could shock the body and mind, especially in a young woman unaware she was pregnant. Yet, her words were used against her. Evelyn reportedly told a nurse she hadn't known what was happening, a phrase interpreted by authorities as concealment, but her defense argued it was confusion, trauma, and fear. As Evelyn lay recovering from blood loss and shock, she was placed under arrest. The charge, aggravated homicide. The penalty, if convicted, 30 years in prison. International human rights groups immediately raised concerns about due process, evidence handling, and the aggressive prosecution of pregnancy-related cases. But for Evelyn, there was no time for protests. She had been accused of killing her own child, and the burden of proof now rested on her defense. The investigation into Evelyn Hernández began with urgency and controversy. Authorities quickly secured the scene, collecting samples from the latrine and photographing the infant's remains. Officers interviewed Evelyn's family, neighbors, and the hospital staff, but no one reported seeing a baby, hearing cries, or witnessing suspicious behavior. Investigators focused heavily on Evelyn's medical records. They claimed her failure to seek prenatal care was intentional. Her silence, her shock, was painted as calculated concealment. Yet, critics argued the investigation lacked objectivity. Key questions went unanswered. Who was the father? Why was the alleged rapist never pursued? And why was Evelyn denied a psychological evaluation until months later? Law enforcement pressed forward, treating Evelyn not as a rape survivor, but as a suspect. No alternative scenarios were seriously examined. No evidence of prior abuse, coercion, or trauma appeared in the official narrative. What remained was a case built on assumption and absence. The forensic examination of the infant's body presented immediate difficulties. The body had been submerged in the latrine for several hours before discovery. By the time forensic experts retrieved it, decomposition had already begun. The umbilical cord was intact. No external injuries were visible. The most debated question was whether the baby had been born alive. An autopsy was conducted, but results were inconclusive. According to reports, the lungs were examined using the hydrostatic test, an outdated method meant to determine if air had entered the lungs. The results were not definitive, and the presence of decomposition made accuracy questionable. The prosecution leaned heavily on this fragile test. The defense argued that without reliable medical proof, any claim that the baby was born alive was purely speculative. No DNA testing was conducted to determine paternity. No toxicology screening was performed on Evelyn. Forensic science, instead of clarifying the truth, deepened the uncertainty. The case of Evelyn Hernández sent shockwaves across El Salvador and beyond. Locally, the response was divided. Some viewed Evelyn with suspicion, a young woman accused of discarding her child. Others saw her as a victim, trapped in a system that offered no support and no options. Activists mobilized quickly. Women's rights groups held rallies outside the courthouse, demanding justice and medical compassion. Social media campaigns called for Evelyn's release, while conservative voices urged the law to remain firm. Across communities, fear began to grow, especially among low-income women. Could they too be jailed for suffering a medical emergency? International media outlets soon picked up Evelyn's story. From BBC to the New York Times, headlines questioned how a teenager recovering from a miscarriage could face a decades-long sentence. Her trial became symbolic of El Salvador's total abortion ban and its consequences. Local media reflected the national divide. Some reports echoed the prosecution's claims. Others spotlighted Evelyn's trauma and the lack of evidence. Televised courtroom footage showed Evelyn, silent and pale, shackled at the wrists. For many watching, her image captured something far greater than one case. It reflected a country's struggle between law, belief, and the rights of women. Despite Evelyn being the only person charged, several questions lingered around the case. Questions that pointed to a broader failure to investigate. The central theory from prosecutors was that Evelyn had willfully concealed her pregnancy, delivered the baby alive, and allowed it to drown. But this theory relied on speculative interpretations, not physical evidence. The defense proposed another theory, that the baby had been stillborn, the result of a preterm labor likely triggered by stress, trauma, or undiagnosed complications. Given the absence of air in the lungs and no sign of external injuries, this possibility carried weight. Some observers raised concern over the identity of the child's father, believed to be a gang member who had allegedly raped Evelyn over several months. Yet law enforcement never pursued this angle. No DNA test was done to confirm paternity. No charges were filed against the alleged perpetrator. In the end, only Evelyn was held accountable. Evelyn's first trial began in July of 2017. The courtroom was tense, with international observers present and cameras flashing outside. Prosecutors asked for a 30-year sentence for aggravated homicide. Evelyn, dressed in white, remained mostly silent, surrounded by supporters who wore shirts demanding justice. The judge ruled in favor of the prosecution. Evelyn was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. In February of 2019, her conviction was overturned on appeal due to insufficient evidence. A retrial was ordered. This time, the outcome changed. On August 19, 2019, after reviewing the forensic reports, the judge declared Evelyn not guilty. The court acknowledged that the prosecution had failed to prove the baby was born alive. Evelyn was finally free, yet her case remains one of the most defining in El Salvador's legal and cultural history. Though Evelyn Hernández was ultimately acquitted, many questions remain. Was the baby born alive, or had it died in the womb? Why was no proper DNA test conducted? And why was the alleged rapist never charged? Could modern forensic tools have provided clearer answers? Even now, the case stirs debate about justice, gender, and power in El Salvador. Dozens of women remain imprisoned under similar circumstances, many still awaiting appeals. Evelyn's story, though resolved in the courtroom, continues to echo in the lives of others. And for those watching, the line between criminal act and medical emergency remains deeply blurred. The case of Evelyn Hernández became a global flashpoint in the fight for reproductive justice. It spotlighted the consequences of El Salvador's total abortion ban and the fragile line between healthcare and criminalization. International pressure grew. Human rights organizations called for reform, while lawmakers debated loosening restrictions. Inside El Salvador, the case emboldened women's movements, sparking protests, petitions, and policy discussions. Though legal change has been slow, Evelyn's case forced the country and the world to reconsider what justice truly looks like. Her name, now etched into history, represents both the pain of persecution and the power of resistance. So, what are your thoughts on the case of Evelyn Hernández? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to Mysteries and Crime for more stories like this, and join us again as we uncover the truths others leave buried. As always, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe.